Grace Williams. A self-made millionaire. Powerful. Graceful. A woman who built an empire with her bare hands and her bare faith. But one day she made a choice that nobody saw coming. She pretended to be paralyzed so she could find out the truth about her only son. He had smiled at her all his life and called her the best mother in the world. But the moment she became helpless, he showed her who he really was, and the maid surprisingly showed her what true love looked like. Hello friends, and welcome to today's story. Before we begin, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from today. We love hearing from you and we read every single one. The morning was quiet and golden. Soft light came through the tall windows of the Williams estate and touched everything gently. The cream-colored walls, the long marble floors, the fresh flowers that the maid Martha had placed on the dining table just an hour before. From the outside, the house looked like something from a dream. A wide, beautiful building surrounded by tall trees and a garden that bloomed in every color. A fountain stood at the center of the front yard, the water catching the morning light and throwing it in every direction like tiny diamonds. But it was not just a rich house. It was a warm house. A house that smelled like good food and fresh linen and the kind of love that takes years to build. A house where people smiled when they walked through the door, not because they were told to, but because something inside the walls made them feel safe. And the woman who built that feeling was Grace Williams. 63 years old. Silver hair, always neat, always elegant. Dark, smooth skin with a quiet glow that made people think she was younger. Brown eyes that were soft but sharp. The kind of eyes that saw everything, missed nothing, but still chose kindness. She walked with her back straight and her chin level, not because she was proud, but because she had learned long ago that the world treats you the way you carry yourself. People who knew Grace Williams said the same things about her. Always the same words. Strong. Generous. Remarkable. She had grown up with very little. No big house. No rich family. No connections or doors opened for her by anyone. Just a young girl with a sharp mind, a strong will, and a mother who told her every night before bed, "Grace, God did not make you small. Don't let the world convince you otherwise." She had taken those words and built a life with them. She started small, a single retail shop in a busy part of the city, selling everyday goods at fair prices. She worked from before sunrise to after midnight. She learned everything herself. She made mistakes and fixed them. She saved every dollar she could, and then she opened a second shop, then a third, then more. Over the years, what had started as one little store became a whole chain of retail businesses spread across the city, known for good quality, honest prices, and a staff that was always treated with respect. Grace never forgot where she came from. That was the thing people admired most about her. She donated to schools in poor neighborhoods. She paid for surgeries for people who could not afford them. She gave jobs to young people who had been turned down everywhere else. She built a small library in one community and a clean water project in another. When reporters asked her why she gave so much, she always smiled and said the same thing, "Because somebody should have done it for me. And since they didn't, I'll do it for someone else." People called her a businesswoman, a philanthropist, a community leader. But what Grace Williams was most proud of, what she held closer than any award or any title, was something much simpler. She was a mother. And not just any kind of mother. People in her circle, her friends, her employees, even strangers who had only heard stories about her, they all said the same thing with the same look on their faces. A kind of quiet wonder, like they were describing someone rare. Grace Williams, they would say, shaking their heads slowly, is the best mother anyone could ever ask for. She had proved it in ways that most people would never be able to imagine. Her son Daniel was 35 years old now. Tall, handsome, well-dressed, with a warm smile he had inherited from his mother. But the most important thing about Daniel Williams, the thing that explained everything about who he was today, was something that had happened when he was just 16 years old. Daniel had gotten sick. Not a small sickness. Not something that rest and medicine could fix. His kidneys had begun to fail. Both of them. Slowly at first, then faster, until the doctor sat Grace down in a small hospital room with pale green walls and fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead, and told her in careful, quiet words that her son's life was in serious danger. Grace had listened to everything they said without blinking. Then she had asked one question. "Can I give him one of mine?" The doctors had explained the risks. The surgery was long and difficult. There was a chance of complications. There was a chance, and they said this carefully, watching her face, that she might not survive it. Grace had been quiet for a moment. Just one moment. Then she had looked at the lead doctor and said 7 words that he would remember for the rest of his career. "Take mine. I can live with one. I can't live without my son." The surgery had lasted 8 hours. There was a point, somewhere in the middle of it, when the doctors feared they were losing her. Her blood pressure had dropped. Her body had struggled. The surgical team had worked with everything they had to bring her back. She had survived. And when she woke up in the recovery room, the first thing she had asked, before she asked about pain, before she asked about herself, was, "Is my son okay?" When the nurse told her Daniel was stable and recovering well, Grace Williams had closed her eyes and smiled. Just smiled. That was the kind of mother she was. Daniel had grown up knowing that story. He had heard it many times. He had stood beside his mother at charity events and listened as she spoke about sacrifice and love, and he had looked at her with what appeared to be deep admiration. He had hugged her in front of guests and said, "I have the best mother in the world." He had sent her flowers on her birthday every year without fail. He had called her his hero. From the outside, the Williams family looked perfect. Daniel now ran a significant part of his mother's business. He drove a silver luxury car and wore suits that were tailored to fit him exactly right. He was engaged to a woman named Vanessa Cole, a tall, stylish woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, who wore her ambition like a piece of expensive jewelry. Vanessa came from a comfortable family, but comfortable was not enough for her. Comfortable had never been enough for Vanessa. People in their social circle liked Daniel. They admired him. They called him a responsible young man, a devoted son, an heir who was being properly prepared to carry on his mother's legacy. They did not see what Grace would eventually see. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. First, we must talk about the third person in that house. The one who moved quietly through the rooms, who cooked the morning tea before anyone else was awake, who remembered every detail that others forgot. Martha Johnson was 56 years old, and she had worked for Grace Williams for 15 years. She was not a tall woman. She was not loud. She did not take up much space in a room, and that was perhaps why people often looked past her. But people who looked past Martha Johnson were making a very expensive mistake, because Martha noticed everything. She saw the things that people tried to hide. She heard the things that were said in low voices. She remembered the things that others assumed were forgotten. She had warm eyes and a quiet voice and hands that were always busy, cooking, cleaning, folding, arranging, fixing. She moved through the Williams estate like water moves through a river, steady and sure, always finding the right path without making noise about it. She had come to work for Grace 15 years ago when she needed a job badly and someone had given her a chance. That someone was Grace. And Martha had never forgotten it. Not for one single day. Over those 15 years, something had grown between them that was harder to explain than a working relationship and simpler to understand than almost anything else. Was love. Real love. The quiet, steady, show-up-everyday kind. Martha remembered Grace's medications without being reminded. She knew which tea Grace liked in the mornings and which one she preferred in the evenings when she couldn't sleep. She knew when Grace's back was hurting by the way she held her shoulders, and she would appear with a warm compress before Grace even thought to ask. She knew when Grace was sad, and she knew when Grace needed silence and when she needed someone to talk to. And Martha always called her by the name she had chosen for her on her 3rd month working in that house. A name that had stuck and never left. Mama Grace. Not because Grace had asked her to. Not because it was in any job description. But because that was what Grace felt like to Martha. That was what she was. A mother figure. A woman worthy of that title in every sense. Grace had once asked her years ago, half joking and half serious, "Martha, why do you work so hard for me? I pay you a fair wage, but you give me more than I pay for." Martha had looked at her without any drama, without any big speech, and said simply, "Because you are good, Mama Grace. And good people deserve good care." That was Martha. And so the three of them lived in that big, beautiful house together, Grace, Daniel, and Martha, each playing their role in a story that from the outside looked like a story of success and family and love. But stories have surfaces and stories have depths. And what lives beneath the surface is often very different from what shines on top. It was a Tuesday evening when the surface cracked for the first time. Grace had not been looking for anything. She had simply been walking down the hallway toward the kitchen, moving quietly in her house slippers, thinking about whether to call her accountant in the morning or wait until Thursday. The lights in the hallway were dim. The house was settling into the quiet comfort of evening. She passed the half-open door of the sitting room and heard voices. Daniel's voice, low and tense, and Vanessa's voice, smooth and certain, the way her voice always was when she was steering a conversation where she wanted it to go. Grace slowed down. She did not mean to listen. But something in the tone of Daniel's voice made her feet stop moving. "I'm tired of waiting," Daniel was saying. "I feel like I'm running her business, not mine. Everything has to go through her. Every big decision, every major contract, she still wants to approve it herself. I'm 35 years old, Vanessa. I know, Vanessa said. If she wasn't controlling everything, I'd already be living my real life. The life I'm supposed to have. There was a pause. Grace stood very still in the hallway, her hand resting lightly on the wall. She acts like she's going to live forever, Daniel said. And there was something in his voice when he said it, something tired and cold and impatient, that made Grace's chest tighten. Vanessa's response came soft and deliberate, each word placed carefully like a stone being set down. Then maybe something needs to change. Silence. Grace stood in the hallway and did not move. She did not go into the room. She did not call out her son's name. She did not make a sound. She simply stood there in the soft darkness of the corridor, with her hand against the wall and her heart sitting very still inside her chest, absorbing what she had just heard. The same son she had given her kidney to. The same boy she had nearly died for on an operating table 19 years ago. The same child she had built every business, signed every contract, worked every late night and made every sacrifice for, so that one day he would have more than she ever had. He was tired of waiting. He was tired of her. Grace slowly pulled her hand away from the wall. She turned around. She walked back to her bedroom quietly, and she closed the door behind her without making a sound. She sat down on the edge of her bed. The same spot where she had sat that very morning, watching the golden light come through the windows and feeling thankful. She sat there for a long time. She did not cry. Not yet. She just sat and thought, in that deep, careful way that had always been her greatest strength, the ability to feel something enormous and still think clearly inside it. She thought about what she had heard. She thought about Vanessa's voice. She thought about her son's impatience, the cold edge in his words, the way he had spoken about her like she was an obstacle standing between him and his real life. And then a question formed in her mind. A question that was also a test. A question that she knew once she asked it she would have to answer fully no matter what the answer turned out to be. Who is my son really? Not when I am strong. Not when I am healthy and powerful and writing checks and signing approvals and running a company worth millions of dollars. Who is my son when I have nothing left to give? Who is he when I become a burden? Grace Williams sat on the edge of her bed for a long time that night. And by the time she finally lay down and closed her eyes, she had already made her decision. She was going to find out. She did not rush. That was the thing about Grace Williams that people who underestimated her always forgot. She never moved out of panic. She never made big decisions out of anger. She had built everything she owned by thinking 3 steps ahead and moving only when she was ready. And she would do the same thing now. For 3 days after that Tuesday evening in the hallway, she went about her normal life. She had breakfast at her usual time. She took her meetings. She reviewed her business reports. She smiled at Daniel when she saw him at dinner and asked him about his day, and he smiled back and answered in the easy, comfortable way he always did, not knowing that the woman sitting across from him had heard every word he said in that sitting room. Grace watched him carefully during those 3 days. Not with anger. Not with accusation. Just with the quiet, patient eyes of a mother who was seeing her child clearly, perhaps for the very first time. She watched the way he checked his phone at the table when he thought she wasn't looking. She watched the way he talked about the business, always using words like, when I take over, and the direction I want to go rather than what we're building together. She watched the way Vanessa sat beside him at dinner on Friday evening, cutting her food slowly, smiling at Grace with that smooth, careful smile that never quite reached her eyes. Grace smiled back every time. On the 4th day she made a phone call. The man she called was Dr. Raymond Ellis, a private doctor she had known and trusted for over 20 years. A quiet man. A serious man. A man who understood discretion the way a surgeon understands a scalpel, as an absolute requirement, not an option. She told him what she needed. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Grace, he said carefully, are you sure about this? Raymond, she said, I have never been more sure of anything in my life. Another pause. It will have to look completely real, he said. The diagnosis, the reports, everything. If anyone checks. I know, she said. That is exactly what I need. Dr. Ellis was quiet for a moment longer. Then he exhaled slowly. All right, he said. Give me a week to prepare everything properly. Thank you, Raymond. She hung up and sat back in her chair. The plan was simple in its design and devastating in its purpose. She would stage a fall, a bad one, the kind that could believably cause spinal damage. Dr. Ellis would handle the medical side. The reports would show damage to the lower spine. The diagnosis would be clear and official. She would be declared paralyzed from the waist down. She would not be able to walk. She would not be able to run her business from the front. She would not be able to do anything for herself without help. She would become, in every visible way, completely dependent. And then she would watch. She would watch her son. She would watch Vanessa. She would watch how love behaves when the person you claim to love has nothing left to offer you. She would find out, once and for all, who Daniel Williams really was. Not the version he performed for dinner guests and business partners and social media photographs, but the real version. The one that only comes out when nobody powerful is watching. The accident happened on a Wednesday morning, 8 days later. Martha had gone to the market. Daniel was at the office. The house was quiet. Grace walked carefully down the staircase, reached the bottom, and then, according to the story that would be told afterward, she missed the last step, lost her balance, and fell hard against the marble floor. When Martha came home 40 minutes later, she found Grace on the floor, conscious but unable to move her legs, her face tight with what appeared to be pain. Martha screamed. She dropped her grocery bags and ran to Grace's side and got down on her knees right there on the cold marble floor, holding Grace's hand, her voice shaking, her eyes wide with terror. Mama Grace, can you hear me? Talk to me. Talk to me right now. Call Dr. Ellis, Grace said quietly. His number is in my phone. Martha's hands were trembling so badly that she nearly dropped the phone twice before she managed to dial. Dr. Ellis arrived within the hour. An ambulance came. There were tests and scans and the long, careful language of medical professionals. Daniel arrived at the hospital that afternoon, his face pale, his tie loosened, moving quickly through the corridors with the look of a man who had received a terrible shock. He held his mother's hand in the hospital room and said, "Mom, I'm here. I'm right here." Grace looked at him and said nothing. Dr. Ellis came in later that evening and delivered the diagnosis in the firm, gentle way he had prepared. Spinal damage from the impact of the fall. The lower spine was affected. The possibility of recovery was uncertain. For now, and for the foreseeable future, Grace Williams would not be able to walk. Daniel sat down slowly in the chair beside the bed. Vanessa, standing near the door with her arms crossed, said nothing. Martha, sitting on the other side of the bed, was crying quietly into a folded handkerchief, her other hand wrapped around Grace's fingers. Grace lay in the hospital bed and looked up at the ceiling. The test had begun. She came home 4 days later in a wheelchair. Martha had prepared everything before she arrived. The downstairs guest room had been converted into Grace's new bedroom so she would not have to manage the stairs. The bathroom had been fitted with handles and a special chair. The doorways had been measured and cleared. Martha had done all of this herself, running from room to room with a measuring tape and a list, making sure that every single thing Grace could possibly need was ready and waiting before she crossed the front door. When the car pulled up and the driver came around to help, it was Martha who appeared first, hurrying down the front steps, her eyes red from days of crying but her movements steady and purposeful. "I have everything ready, Mama Grace," she said softly, leaning close. "Everything is ready. You just come inside and rest." Grace reached up and touched Martha's cheek briefly. Just for a second. Martha helped her from the car and into the wheelchair, careful and gentle, one hand supporting Grace's back and one guiding the chair, moving slowly up the ramp that she had arranged to be installed the day before. Daniel stood on the front step and watched. He had his hands in his pockets. He said, "Welcome home, Mom," when they reached him. Grace looked up at him from the wheelchair. "Thank you, son," she said. He nodded and stepped aside to let them pass. That first week was the week of small signs. Martha slept on a cot she had placed just outside Grace's bedroom door, so she could hear if anything happened in the night. She woke early every morning to prepare Grace's breakfast exactly the way she liked it. Soft boiled eggs, thin slices of toast with just a little butter, a cup of ginger tea with 1 spoon of honey. She helped Grace wash and dress each morning with such quiet dignity that Grace never once felt small or embarrassed. She moved around Grace with the kind of care you give to something precious and irreplaceable. She cried every day that first week. Not in front of Grace, she tried very hard not to do that, but Grace heard her sometimes in the hallway, or in the kitchen when she thought the house was quiet enough to let it out. Small, muffled crying. The kind of crying that comes from real grief. Daniel's response was different. The first day he had been attentive. He had come to check on Grace twice, asked if she needed anything, and sat with her for about 20 minutes in the evening while she watched television. Grace had watched him during those 20 minutes. He had sat forward with his elbows on his knees, and she could see the slight tension in his jaw, the way his eyes kept moving toward the door, the way he checked his watch once and then pretended he hadn't. By the third day his visits had shortened. By the 5th day he came once in the morning and once at night, each time for just a few minutes. By the end of the 2nd week, he had stopped coming in the mornings entirely. When Grace needed something and Martha was not immediately available, Daniel would appear in the doorway, look at his mother in the wheelchair or lying in the adjusted bed, and something would flicker across his face. Something that was not quite sadness and not quite irritation but lived in the uncomfortable space between the two. "Is there something you need, Mom?" he would ask. "Just some water, Daniel." He would bring the water. He would set it on the table beside her. And then he would leave. He stopped meeting her eyes. Grace noticed. She noticed everything, lying in that bed, sitting in that wheelchair, being pushed through the garden by Martha on the afternoons when the weather was kind. She noticed and she said nothing, and she stored every single thing in the quiet chambers of her mind like a woman building a case, because that was exactly what she was doing. She was building a case. And the evidence was coming in piece by careful piece. It was during the 3rd week that Daniel started asking about the money. It began quietly, the way most dangerous things begin. Not with a loud demand or an obvious grab, but with a soft question asked in a reasonable voice, wearing the clothes of concern. He came to Grace's room one evening and sat in the chair beside her bed. He had his phone in his hand and a look on his face that he had clearly practiced before walking through the door. Thoughtful. Caring. A son worried about his mother. "Mom," he said, "I've been thinking about the business accounts." Grace looked at him calmly. "What about them?" "Well, with everything that's happened, with your condition, there are decisions that need to be made quickly sometimes. Approvals that can't wait. I think it would make more sense if I had fuller access. Just so things keep running smoothly while you're recovering." Grace was quiet for a moment. "The business is running fine, Daniel," she said. "My team knows what to do. And I can still review documents from here." Daniel nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they are pretending to accept an answer they have no intention of accepting. "Of course," he said. "I just don't want you to stress yourself." He left the room. He came back with the same conversation 4 days later, dressed slightly differently. This time it was about relieving her burden. This time Vanessa was with him, sitting on the small sofa near the window with her legs crossed and her hands folded neatly in her lap, adding small supportive sounds at the right moments. And that's all we're saying, and it just makes sense, Grace." Grace looked at Vanessa for a long moment. Then she looked at her son. "I appreciate your concern," she said. "Both of you. But I am still the owner of my company. A wheelchair has not changed that." Vanessa smiled. It was a thin smile. Daniel said, "Nobody is saying it has, Mom." But the way he said "Mom" had begun to change. Grace heard it. The word was still there, but the warmth inside it was thinning, the way fabric thins when it has been washed too many times. It still looked like the same word. But it no longer felt like it. Martha heard these conversations too. She was often in the room or just outside it, and she had the gift of invisibility that comes to people who are quiet and consistent. After a while, others forget they are there. Daniel and Vanessa had long since stopped being careful about what they said in front of Martha. She was the maid. She was furniture. She did not count. That was their second most expensive mistake. Their first was underestimating Grace. One morning, about a month after Grace had come home from the hospital, Martha came into the bedroom carrying the breakfast tray and found Grace sitting by the window looking out at the garden. The light was soft and gray that morning. Rain had fallen in the night and everything outside was still damp and quiet. Martha set the tray down and began arranging it without speaking, moving the small vase of flowers to the side, unfolding the cloth napkin, placing the tea exactly where Grace could reach it comfortably. "Martha," Grace said softly, still looking out the window. "Yes, Mama Grace? Do you ever get tired?" Martha paused for just a moment, then continued arranging the tray. "Of what?" she asked. "Of this. Of me. Of all of this extra work that my situation has put on you." Martha straightened up and looked at Grace with an expression that was so direct and so full of something genuine that it was almost startling in its simplicity. "Mama Grace," she said, "taking care of you is not extra work. It is the most important thing I do." Grace turned from the window and looked at her. "You don't have to say that." "I know I don't have to," Martha said. "That is exactly why I am saying it." She picked up the teacup and brought it over to Grace and placed it carefully in her hands, making sure Grace's grip was steady before she let go. Then she pulled a small footstool close and sat down on it so that she was at eye level with Grace, the way she had started doing in recent weeks, always making sure she was never talking down to her, never making her feel small. "Do you know what I pray for every night?" Martha said. Grace shook her head slightly. "I pray that God gives you your strength back. I pray that you wake up one morning and your legs work again and you walk through this house the way you used to. Fast and sure like you own the whole world. She smiled a little. Because you do, Mama Grace. You own your world. And no fall can take that from you. Grace looked at this woman sitting on a small footstool in the gray morning light, this woman who had worked in her house for 15 years, who had no obligation beyond a fair wage and a job description, and she felt something move in her chest that was so large and so warm that she had to look away for a moment before she could trust her face. The garden outside was still. The rain had left small drops on the window glass that caught the light and held it. Grace Williams, who had not cried since the night she sat on the edge of her bed after overhearing her son in the sitting room, felt 2 tears run down her face. She did not wipe them away. She let them fall. Martha reached out and took her hand and held it, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the tea went slightly cool in Grace's cup, and neither of them minded. That same evening, Daniel came home with Vanessa and the two of them had dinner in the dining room while Martha brought Grace her meal in the bedroom. Grace could hear them through the house. The clink of cutlery, the low sound of conversation, occasional laughter. Her dining room. Her table. Her house. She ate her food quietly and listened. After dinner, she heard them move to the sitting room. The television went on for a while, then off. Then their voices dropped low, the way voices do when people believe they are alone and safe. Martha was passing by the hallway with a basket of folded laundry when she heard it too. She slowed her steps. Grace, whose bedroom door was slightly open, heard it clearly. Daniel was speaking. She's not getting better, Vanessa. It has been over a month. The doctors don't know when or if the feeling will come back. This could be permanent. I know, Vanessa said. This house feels like a hospital now. Pause. I didn't sign up for this. Vanessa's voice was careful and low. Nobody is saying you did. I have a life to live. We have a life to live. I can't spend the next 10 or 20 years organizing around a wheelchair. Then don't, Vanessa said. Simply. Cleanly. Like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Silence. Then Daniel said the words that Grace had been half expecting and wholly dreading. How long is this going to be our life? Not her life. Not his mother's life, which had been upended by a fall and a medical diagnosis and the loss of her ability to move freely through the world. Our life. As in, our inconvenience. Our disruption. Our problem to manage. Grace lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling. She had given this man one of her kidneys. She had nearly died so he could live. She had worked for 30 years to build something he could inherit. She had loved him with everything she had, held nothing back, given every version of herself. The young struggling version, the building version, the successful version, all of them, to making sure his life was good. And she was an inconvenience. She closed her eyes. She did not cry this time. She just listened and remembered and added it to the case she was building. Outside in the hallway, Martha stood very still with the laundry basket in her arms. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were bright with something that was not sadness, something harder than sadness. She stood there until the voices in the sitting room moved on to other things. Then she walked quietly to the linen closet, put the basket down, and stood there alone in the small space for a moment with her hand pressed flat against the shelf. Then she straightened up, picked the basket back up, and walked back to Grace's room. She knocked softly and opened the door. Grace was lying down, her eyes open, looking at the ceiling. Martha did not say she had heard anything. She did not mention Daniel or Vanessa or what had been said down the hall. She simply came in, set the basket down, and began quietly folding the last few pieces of laundry on the small chair in the corner. After a moment she began to hum. The soft low song. Something old and gentle that had no sharp edges. Grace turned her head and looked at her. Martha kept folding. Kept humming. And slowly, the tight thing in Grace's chest began to loosen just a little. Just enough. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm. Martha's rhythm. Every morning before the sun was fully up, before Daniel's alarm had gone off down the hall, before Vanessa's expensive Parfum One Me had begun drifting through the upper floor of the house, Martha was already awake. Already moving. Already beginning the long, careful work of making sure Grace Williams started her day with dignity. She would heat the water for the bath first. Then prepare the morning medications. 4 small pills lined up in a row on a white saucer, each one in its correct position because Martha had learned long ago which ones Grace could take together and which one needed to be taken alone with a full glass of water. Then she would prepare breakfast, moving around the kitchen in the early quiet with an ease that came from years of knowing exactly where everything was. By the time she knocked on Grace's bedroom door, everything was ready. And every night, after the house had gone completely still and Daniel and Vanessa had retreated to the upper floor and all the lights except the small lamp in the hallway had been turned off, Martha would kneel beside her own small bed in the room adjacent to Grace's and she would pray. Not short prayers. Not the quick, duty-bound kind that people say because they feel they ought to. Long, genuine prayers, spoken in a whisper, with her hands folded and her eyes closed and her whole heart in it. She prayed for Grace's comfort. She prayed for Grace's peace. She prayed every single night without skipping one, that God would restore Grace's strength and give her back the full use of her body. She prayed with the kind of faith that doesn't require evidence, the stubborn, decided kind. Grace could hear her sometimes through the thin wall between their rooms. The low murmur of Martha's voice in the dark, steady and earnest. On those nights, Grace would lie still and listen and feel something settle inside her like a heavy thing finding its right place on a shelf. During the long afternoon hours when the house was slow and the day had nowhere particular to go, Martha would sit beside Grace and tell her stories. Old stories, funny stories, stories from her own childhood that she had never told anyone else. She would describe the mango tree in the yard where she grew up, how she and her sisters would climb it every Saturday morning and eat until their fingers were sticky and their mother would call up at them from below, pretending to be angry but laughing at the same time. She would tell Grace about the first time she ever cooked a full meal by herself, 12 years old, trying to make her grandmother's pepper soup, adding so much pepper that her eyes ran with tears the whole time she stirred the pot. Grace would laugh. Real laughter. The kind that starts small and then takes over your whole face before you can stop it. Martha had a gift for finding that laughter and pulling it out of Grace even on the heaviest days, and she used that gift deliberately, like a doctor using the right medicine at the right time. And every evening before Grace went to sleep, Martha would do one more thing. She would pull back the bedsheet and with her warm, capable hands she would gently massage Grace's legs. Both of them. From the knee down to the foot and back again. Slow, careful movements. Firm enough to increase circulation, gentle enough to cause no discomfort. The legs that were supposed to be paralyzed. The legs that felt every single thing. Grace would lie there and feel Martha's hands working and keep her face completely still and steady, and inside she would be fighting an emotion so large she sometimes had to focus on her breathing to contain it. Because Martha knew, medically speaking, that massaging paralyzed legs was mostly about preventing stiffness and maintaining the muscle. There was no sensation to restore through touch. A person who could not feel would not benefit from massage the way a person with working nerves would. Martha knew this. She did it anyway. Every evening. Without being asked. Without complaint. Without any expectation that it would make a physical difference. She did it because it was care. Because it was the thing a person does when they love someone and they refuse to stop trying, even when trying seems pointless. Because Martha Johnson had decided, somewhere deep in herself, that as long as she had hands and Grace was in front of her, she would use those hands to say what words sometimes could not. One evening Grace finally asked her about it. "Martha," she said softly, "why do you massage my legs every night?" "The doctor said there is no feeling there." Martha did not stop the slow movement of her hands. She looked up at Grace with those steady, warm eyes of hers and said something that Grace would carry with her for the rest of her life. "I know, Mama Grace. But my hands don't know that. My hands just know you." She paused, then added, "And even if you never walk again, I will walk for you. Every step I take in this house, I take for both of us. You're not going anywhere alone. Not while I am here." Grace turned her face toward the window. Outside, the night was deep and quiet. A few stars were visible between the clouds. She did not make a sound. But 2 tears ran down the side of her face and disappeared into the pillow beneath her head, and Martha, who saw everything, said nothing and simply continued her work, humming that same low, gentle song, filling the room with the kind of warmth that cannot be bought at any price. It was 11 days after that evening when Grace heard the conversation that broke something open inside her. She had been awake since early morning, lying in bed, when she heard Daniel and Vanessa in the hallway outside her door. They were speaking in lowered voices, but the house was quiet and the door was not fully closed and every word reached her as clearly as if they had been sitting beside her. "I made some calls this week," Vanessa said. "And?" Daniel's voice. "There's a private facility about 2 hours from here. Very clean, very well staffed. They specialize in long-term care for people with mobility issues. It's not cheap, but it's not like we can't afford it." Pause. "You're serious," Daniel said. "Daniel." Vanessa's voice took on that particular tone she used when she wanted to sound reasonable while saying something ruthless. "Look at this situation clearly. She is not getting better. The doctors have not given any timeline. This could go on for years. You cannot build your life around pushing a wheelchair. You cannot run a business and manage a household that functions like a care facility at the same time. There are professionals who do this. People trained for exactly this kind of situation. She would never agree to it. She doesn't have to agree first. We present it as the best option. We explain it properly. We frame it as being for her benefit. A brief silence. Which it is, in a way. She would have professional care around the clock. Better than anything Martha can offer. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Let me think about it." "Don't think too long," Vanessa said. And her heels clicked away down the hallway. Grace lay completely still in her bed. A private facility. 2 hours away. Out of her house. Away from her business. Away from everything she had built. Placed somewhere out of sight and out of influence, where she could not see what was happening to her company or her estate or the life she had spent 30 years constructing. Get her out. That was what it meant. However it was dressed up, however it was explained and framed and presented, it meant get her out. She is in the way. She is a problem that needs to be relocated. She is an inconvenience that has gone on long enough. She heard Daniel's footsteps move away down the hall. She stared at the ceiling. And then, 3 days later, she heard the worst of it. She had not been meant to hear this one either. She had been sitting in her wheelchair near the partially open door of the small study down the hall from her bedroom, where Martha had placed her earlier in the afternoon near the window with a book and a cup of tea. Martha had gone to the kitchen. The house had settled into its afternoon quiet. Daniel came into the study without seeing her. He was on his phone, his back half-turned, speaking in a low, frustrated voice. Vanessa must have been on the other end. "I know," he was saying. "I know. But she keeps pushing back on the financial documents. She won't sign anything major without reviewing it herself. It's like she doesn't trust me." A pause while he listened. "I'm handling it. I've already spoken to the accountant separately. There are a few transfers I can move forward with without her direct signature. Technically within my existing authorization. It's fine." Grace's hand tightened slightly on the armrest of her wheelchair. He had not seen her yet. He was pacing slowly, facing the window. "Vanessa, I've waited long enough," he said, and his voice had dropped into something harder, something that had stopped pretending to be reasonable. "I have run this business for years. I have sat in the background for years. I have played the good son for years." He stopped pacing. "I already sacrificed enough for her. I can't sacrifice my whole life." Grace closed her eyes. "I already sacrificed enough for her." His words sat in the room like something physical. Like furniture that had been dropped from a great height and landed wrong. Sacrificed enough for her. The man speaking those words was alive because of her kidney. Was educated because of her money. Was driving that silver car and wearing those tailored suits and running that business because of her work and her years and her blood. Literally her blood and her body and her nearly ended life on an operating table 19 years ago. And he had sacrificed enough. Daniel turned from the window and finally saw her. The shock on his face lasted only a second before he composed himself. "Mom," he said. "I didn't see you there. How long have you?" He stopped. Grace looked at him. Her face was calm. Her eyes were steady. "Martha must have fallen asleep in the kitchen," she said quietly. "You know how she does in the afternoons sometimes." Daniel looked at her for a moment, trying to read how much she had heard. Then he looked away. "I'll go check on her," he said and left the room. Grace sat in her wheelchair alone in the study. Outside the window, a bird landed on the garden wall, looked around for a moment and flew away. She sat there for a long time. She was no longer building a case. The case was built. What was coming now was the verdict. And in the weeks that followed, the last pieces of Daniel Williams fell away one by one, like paint peeling from a wall that had never been properly prepared, revealing, underneath, the bare and sorry truth of what was actually there. He stopped calling her mom. It happened gradually and then completely. First it became she when he spoke to Martha about her. "Tell her the documents are ready," or, "Ask her if she needs anything before I leave." Then it became nothing at all. He stopped addressing her directly if he could avoid it. He stopped coming to her room unless he needed something. When they were in the same space he looked at the wall or at his phone or at Vanessa but rarely at Grace. He spoke through Martha entirely. Martha became the messenger, the go-between, the human telephone wire stretched between a mother and the son who could no longer look at her. Martha carried his messages to Grace and carried Grace's responses back, her face carefully neutral, her voice carefully steady, her eyes carefully not showing what she thought about what she was being used for. And the money. The money moved quietly the way water moves through a crack, slowly at first, then faster. Documents were signed that Grace had not authorized. Account structures shifted. Vendors received communications from Daniel directly, without Grace's knowledge, establishing him as the primary contact. Business decisions were made and announced as though they had already been settled, presented to Grace after the fact with the air of someone reporting news rather than seeking approval. He had begun to act like the owner. Not the heir. Not the son learning from the founder. The owner. The one who had arrived and taken the keys. Grace watched all of this from her wheelchair and said very little and recorded everything, the way a still lake records everything that falls into it. The rock, the leaf, the ripple, all of it held in the water's perfect patient memory. And then came the day that nobody in that room would ever forget. It was a Thursday afternoon. A normal-looking Thursday with gray skies and the smell of coming rain in the air. Daniel and Vanessa had been talking in the sitting room, and Martha was nearby doing what she always did, being invisible and noticing everything. They were talking about the nursing home plan again. The private facility. The timeline. Vanessa had apparently done more research and had a folder of printed information that she was going through with Daniel, pointing at pages, outlining costs and logistics, explaining the transfer process as though she were planning a business relocation, which in her mind Grace supposed was exactly what it was. Daniel was nodding along. He had passed the stage of hesitation entirely. It was clear in his posture, in the certainty of his responses, that he had decided. The only remaining question was execution. Then Vanessa said something about the original business documents, the founding structures, the ownership history, and Daniel made a sound of frustration and said, in a voice that had run completely out of pretense, none of this would even be complicated if things had just gone differently back then. Vanessa glanced at him. What do you mean? Daniel sat back. When he spoke, his voice was flat and cold in a way that seemed to surprise even him, as though the words had come up from somewhere he hadn't fully intended to open. When she had the surgery, he said. The kidney surgery. When she gave me hers. He paused. There was a point where the doctors thought they might lose her. I found out years later. He looked at the folder in Vanessa's hands. If she had died during surgery back then, none of this would be happening. The room went completely silent. Even Vanessa went still. She looked at Daniel with an expression that was difficult to name. Not quite horror. Not quite disbelief. Something quieter than both of those things. Something that looked, for just one moment, like shame. Daniel seemed to hear what he had just said landing in the room. He looked down at the folder. He did not take it back. In the hallway, Martha stood with both hands pressed flat against the wall and her eyes closed. In the bedroom, Grace, who had heard every word through the small speaker of the discreetly placed recording device she had asked Dr. Ellis to help her set up 3 weeks earlier, sat in her wheelchair with her hands folded in her lap and her face very still. And something inside Grace Williams, the last soft thing she had been holding onto, the last thread of hoping she had been wrong about her son, went quietly and finally still. She was ready. It was time. She did not move that evening. She sat in her wheelchair as the house darkened around her and the rain that had been threatening all day finally came, soft at first, then steady, drumming against the windows in long even sheets. Martha brought her dinner and sat with her while she ate, and Grace was quieter than usual, and Martha did not push her to talk. She simply stayed close the way she always did, a warm and steady presence in the room. That night, Grace made 2 phone calls. The first was to Dr. Ellis. It's time, Raymond, she said. He understood immediately. I'll be there Friday morning, he said. I'll bring everything we need. The second call was to her lawyer, a sharp, careful woman named Patricia Moore who had handled Grace's legal affairs for 12 years and who Grace trusted completely. She told Patricia what she needed prepared. Patricia listened without interrupting, asked 3 precise questions and said, "It will be ready by Friday afternoon." Grace hung up and sat in the dark for a moment. Then she said, to no one in particular, to the quiet room and the rain against the window and whatever else might be listening, "All right. Let's finish this." She told Martha the next morning. She had to. Martha was the only person in that house who deserved the truth before it arrived, and Grace was not willing to put her through what was coming without preparing her first. Martha sat on the small footstool the way she always did when they talked, and she listened without a word while Grace told her everything. The overheard conversation. The decision. Dr. Ellis. The recording device. All of it. Every piece of the plan from the beginning to where they now stood, one day from the end. When Grace finished, Martha was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked up. Her eyes were wet but her voice was steady. "You heard them from the very beginning?" she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Grace said. Martha nodded slowly. She looked at her hands in her lap. Then she looked back at Grace. And you never told me. I needed you to be real, Grace said gently. Everything you did, I needed it to be because of who you are. Not because you knew you were being watched. Martha sat with that for a moment. Then she nodded again, and this time something in her face settled into a kind of quiet understanding that was also a kind of peace. What do you need me to do? She asked. Just be here, Grace said. Stand beside me. That is all I have ever needed from you. Friday came. Daniel arrived home that afternoon in his silver car with Vanessa beside him and a leather folder tucked under his arm. He came through the front door with the particular energy of a man who has made a decision and arrived to carry it out. Purposeful, slightly tense, moving with the forward momentum of someone who does not intend to leave without what he came for. He found Grace in the sitting room. She was in her wheelchair, positioned near the center of the room, dressed neatly in a deep blue dress that Martha had helped her into that morning. Her silver hair was pinned back. Her hands were folded in her lap. She looked, as she always looked, composed and elegant and entirely herself. Martha stood beside her. Slightly behind and to the left, the way she had stood beside Grace for 15 years. Close enough to help, quiet enough to be overlooked. Daniel glanced at Martha briefly, the way you glance at a piece of furniture, then looked at his mother. Mom, he said, which was the first time he had used that word directly in several weeks, and the fact that he had retrieved it for this occasion, for this particular task, was not lost on Grace. He sat down on the sofa across from her and placed the leather folder on the coffee table between them. Vanessa sat beside him, smooth and composed, her hands folded exactly like Grace's. We need to talk about some things, Daniel said. Then talk, Grace said. He opened the folder. There were several documents inside, organized in neat sections. He had prepared this carefully. That much was clear. The first set of documents is a formal transfer of operational control of the business, he said, his voice measured and professional. It formalizes what has essentially already been happening. I've been running operations for months now and it makes sense to make it official. It protects the company and it protects you. He slid the first document across the table toward her. Grace looked at it but did not touch it. And the second set, she said. Daniel glanced at Vanessa briefly. Then back at Grace. The second set is regarding your care arrangements going forward. He kept his voice even. We found an excellent private facility. The best available. Around-the-clock professional care, specialized staff, beautiful grounds. It's 2 hours from here but we would visit regularly. He paused. It's the right environment for someone in your condition, Mom. Better than we can provide here. He slid the second document across to join the first. Then he leaned forward slightly and said the words with the particular tone of a man who believes he is being generous. Just sign. This is for the best. The room was very quiet. Rain was still falling softly outside. Martha did not move. Grace looked at the documents on the table in front of her. She looked at them for a long, unhurried moment, the way she looked at everything, fully, clearly, without flinching. Then she placed both hands on the armrests of her wheelchair. And she stood up. Not slowly, not dramatically, not with any performance. She simply stood, the way a person stands when they are done sitting, with purpose and with ease and with the full weight of themselves behind it. She rose from that wheelchair and she stood upright in the middle of her sitting room, in her deep blue dress, her back straight, her silver hair pinned back, her brown eyes fixed on her son's face. And she took one step forward. Then another. The leather folder slid slightly on the table as Daniel lurched backward on the sofa, knocking into Vanessa, his face draining of color in a way that was almost physical to watch, like water rushing out of a container all at once. His mouth opened. Nothing came out for a moment. Then, you can walk? Grace stopped 2 steps from the coffee table. She stood there and looked at her son, really looked at him all the way through the expensive suit and the rehearsed voice and the leather folder full of documents, and she looked at him the way only a mother can look at a child she has known since before he took his first breath. I was never paralyzed, she said. I was watching. The silence that followed those 6 words was the loudest silence Grace had ever stood inside. Daniel stared at her. Vanessa had gone very still beside him, her composure fractured for the first time, a crack running right through the center of that smooth, carefully maintained surface. Daniel's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. What do you mean you were watching? What? How long? From the beginning, Grace said. She moved to the small table beside the bookshelf where a slim black device sat beside a stack of books. She picked it up and pressed play. His voice came out of it and filled the room. First the sitting room conversation. The very first one, the night she had stood in the hallway in her slippers. his voice young and impatient and cold. "I'm tired of waiting. She acts like she'll live forever." And Vanessa's response, smooth as a blade, "Then maybe something needs to change." Daniel closed his eyes. Then the conversation from the study. "I already sacrificed enough for her. I can't sacrifice my whole life." Vanessa looked at the floor. Then the financial conversations. The plans made behind Grace's back. The account restructuring. The vendors contacted without her knowledge. His voice explaining to someone on the phone how to move money within his existing authorization, confident that no one who mattered was listening. Daniel's hands were gripping the edge of the sofa. And then the last one. The worst one. His voice from just days ago, flat and cold and arriving in the room now like something that could not be taken back. If she had died during surgery back then, none of this would be happening. The recording stopped. Vanessa stood up from the sofa. She picked up her bag from beside her feet. She did not look at Daniel. She did not look at Grace. She walked to the door of the sitting room and she stopped there with her back to both of them, and for a moment she stood very still, and Grace thought she might turn around. She did not turn around. She walked out. Her heels faded down the hallway and then the front door opened and closed, and that was the last sound Vanessa Cole made in that house. Daniel sat alone on the sofa. He looked like something that had been taken apart. His face had lost all of its careful arrangement, all of its practiced expressions, and what was underneath was something raw and young and frightened. The face, Grace thought, of a 16-year-old boy in a hospital bed, not yet knowing what his mother was about to give up for him. He looked at her. Anne Grace Williams looked back at her son. This man she had carried in her body, fed from her table, educated with her money, saved with her kidney, loved with every version of herself she had ever been, and she spoke from the deepest and most honest place inside her. "I gave you life twice," she said. "Once when you were born and once when I put myself on an operating table and told them to take my kidney so you could survive. I nearly died for you. And I did not regret it. Not for one single day." She paused. "And you sat in this house and called me an inconvenience. You planned to put me away in a facility so I would be out of your sight. You moved my money and signed my documents and began dismantling what I built, while I was still alive. While I was still in this house." Her voice did not shake. It was not loud. It was simply clear. "And then you said that everything would have been easier if I had died on that table." Daniel's face broke. "Mom? I am not finished," she said. He went silent. "I spent weeks in that wheelchair watching you become someone I don't recognize," Grace said. "And the hardest part is not the anger. I can manage anger. The hardest part is the grief. Grieving a child who is still standing in front of you. Grieving the son I believed you were." She walked to the desk in the corner of the room. She opened the drawer and removed a document that Patricia Moore had prepared and delivered the previous afternoon. "I had my lawyer draw this up yesterday," she said. She placed it on the coffee table on top of Daniel's folder. "Your name has been removed from my will. Your signing authority on all business accounts has been revoked as of this morning. Your position in my company is terminated, effective today. The apartment and the car that were provided to you through company resources will need to be vacated and returned within 30 days. Daniel stared at the document. "You are not being left with nothing," Grace said. "You are a grown man with an education and years of business experience. You will be all right. But you will build your life with your own hands the way I built mine." She looked at him steadily. "You are no longer my heir, Daniel. And what grieves me most, what I will carry longest, is that you are no longer my son in the way that word is supposed to mean. You are a man who survived me. But you are not someone who deserves me." Daniel's head dropped into his hands. His shoulders shook. He sat on that sofa and he wept in the way that people weep when they know they have gone too far to come back. Not clean grief, but the ugly, cornered kind, full of the sudden sharp awareness of everything that has just been lost. Grace watched him for a moment. Then she turned away, because there was someone else in the room. Martha had not moved from her position beside the wheelchair. She was standing exactly where she had been standing when Grace rose from it, slightly to the left, slightly behind, close enough to help. Her eyes were wet. Her hands were clasped in front of her. She was looking at Grace with an expression that held so many things at once that it could not be named with a single word. Grace walked to her. She stood in front of Martha Johnson and she looked at this woman. This quiet, faithful, extraordinary woman who had prayed for her every night and massaged her legs every evening and told her stories to make her laugh and hummed soft songs in the dark and walked through 15 years of service with nothing but consistency and love and showed up every single day not because she had to but because she had decided to. "Martha," Grace said. Martha pressed her lips together and nodded, trying to hold herself steady. You carried me when I couldn't walk, Grace said. And you would have carried me even if I could never walk again. I know that. I know it the way I know my own name. Martha shook her head slightly, trying to deflect, the way she always deflected. Quiet, humble, unwilling to take up too much space. Mama Grace. Let me finish, Grace said gently. Martha went still. I am making changes to my company structure, Grace said. I have spoken to my board and my lawyer. Effective next week, you will be appointed to a senior executive role in the Williams Foundation, the charitable arm of everything I have built. You will have a salary that reflects your value, not your job title. And the house on Birchwood Lane, the small one with the garden that you told me once you thought was the most beautiful house you had ever seen, I have bought it. It is yours. Fully paid. Your name is already on the deed. Martha's hand came up to cover her mouth. And those things are important, Grace continued, but they are not the most important thing I want to say to you today. She reached out and took both of Martha's hands in hers. The most important thing is this. You are my family. Not because I have decided to reward you, but because you proved it. Every single day, without knowing you were being tested, without any audience, without anything to gain, you proved it. Martha was crying now. Silently, the way Grace had cried into her pillow on so many nights. Not performing grief but simply living it, simply letting it move through her the way real things move. You are my family, Grace said again, squeezing her hands. And I am yours. And that does not end when I sign a check or update a document. It is simply true now. It has been true for a long time. I'm only saying it out loud today. Martha pulled Grace into her arms. And Grace held on. Behind them, Daniel stood from the sofa. He looked at the two of them for a moment. His mother and the maid holding each other in the middle of the sitting room, and something moved across his face that was beyond embarrassment and beyond shame and was simply the hollow, echoing recognition of what he had thrown away. He picked up his leather folder from the coffee table. He left it. He walked to the door of the sitting room and he stopped. Mom, he said one last time. Grace did not turn around. After a long moment he walked out. The front door opened. The front door closed. And the house was quiet. Grace and Martha stood together in the middle of the sitting room while the rain fell softly outside and the afternoon light came through the tall windows in long pale sheets, and neither of them spoke for a while. They did not need to. Some things have already been fully said by the time you reached the silence. The months that followed were not loud months. They were not dramatic or fast-moving or full of the kind of events that make headlines. They were quiet months, building months, the kind that look small from the outside and feel enormous from the inside. Grace walked through her house again. Through every room, down every hallway, out into the garden in the mornings, along the stone path that curved around the fountain, under the tall trees that were turning from green to gold as the season changed. She walked the way a person walks when they have remembered how good it feels, deliberately, gratefully, with full attention. She returned to her business. Not in the frantic, prove-something way of someone reclaiming territory, but in the calm, clear way of a woman who had always known what she was doing and was simply coming back to it. Her team had managed well in her absence, and she thanked them individually, each one by name. She restructured where things had been disrupted. She corrected what had been moved without authorization. She restored what needed restoring. Martha came to the office with her 3 days a week. It took Martha several weeks to stop being uncomfortable about it, to stop arriving early to make the tea and straighten things that did not need straightening, to stop instinctively stepping back when Grace's senior staff addressed her directly. Old habits of smallness do not leave overnight. But Grace was patient, the way Grace was patient about everything, and slowly Martha began to take up the space that had been made for her. Began to speak in meetings with the quiet authority of someone whose observations are always worth hearing. Began to sign her name on documents and read reports and contribute to decisions with the steady, careful intelligence that Grace had watched and valued for 15 years but that the world was only now being introduced to. Martha moved into the house on Birchwood Lane on a Saturday in October. Grace helped her. Not because Martha needed help, the house was small and the move was manageable, but because Grace wanted to be there. She wanted to stand in that garden with the small stone path and the rose bushes along the back fence and watch Martha walk through the front door of her own home for the first time, and she wanted to see that expression on Martha's face. It was worth every minute of the drive. They had lunch together in the kitchen of the new house, sitting on boxes because the chairs had not yet been positioned, eating sandwiches that Grace had packed in a bag that morning, laughing at the impracticality of it, at the two of them, this unlikely pair, sitting on cardboard boxes in an empty kitchen, eating sandwiches, being completely at home. The Williams Foundation was launched formally that November. Its mission was simple and direct: supporting families in financial crisis, funding medical care for those who could not afford it, building and stocking libraries in underserved communities, providing business education and seed funding for young people who had the hunger but not the resources. All the things that nobody had done for Grace when she needed them. All the things she had promised herself she would do for others. Martha ran it with a combination of warmth and precision that made Grace proud every single day. At the launch event, a journalist asked Grace what had inspired her to formalize the foundation and expand its work so significantly. Grace thought about the question for a moment. She thought about a wheelchair in the middle of a sitting room. She thought about a leather folder on a coffee table. She thought about 2 tears running down her face in the early morning light while a woman sat on a small footstool and massaged legs that could feel every touch. She said, "I learned something important this year. I learned that love is not proven when you are strong. Anyone can love a strong person. Love is proven when you are helpless. When you have nothing to offer and nothing to give and nothing to protect anyone with. The people who stay then, the people who show up then, those are the people who love you. And I wanted to build something that helps people find that kind of love. Not just the feeling of it but the stability that allows it to grow." The journalist wrote it down. It appeared in the paper the following morning. People shared it widely. Grace did not see most of the sharing. She was too busy. She had a foundation to run and a company to lead and a garden to walk through in the mornings and a friend to have lunch with on Wednesdays and a full, good, honest life to live. She had everything she needed. And in the evenings, sometimes, when the work was done and the house was settling into its quiet, Grace would sit by the tall window in her bedroom, the same window she had stood at on all those golden mornings before any of this began, and she would think about the year that had passed. She did not think about it with bitterness. Bitterness was a thing that required you to keep carrying what had hurt you, and Grace Williams had never been willing to carry anything that didn't deserve the weight. She thought about it with clarity. With the particular piece of a person who asked a hard question and stayed through the full answer, no matter how painful, and came out the other side knowing more truth than they had before. She had given her son life twice. She had given him her kidney and her years and her money and her love in every form love can take. And he had chosen in the end to see all of it as something owed to him. That was not her failure. That was his. And she had found, in the same house, in the same year, in the same quiet rooms where that loss had happened, she had found something that many people search for their whole lives and never locate. She had found someone who loved her for nothing. Not for the business. Not for the estate. Not for the checks or the access or the inheritance or the influence. For nothing except Grace herself. The woman, the person, the human being who got tired and laughed at old stories and cried silently into her pillow and needed her tea a certain way and deserved, like every person deserves, to be cared for without conditions. That woman, the woman who had found her, was Martha Johnson. And Grace Williams would say it the same way every time someone asked her about the most important thing she had ever built. "Blood gave me a son," she would say. "But loyalty gave me a sister." She would pause. Then she would add in the quiet, certain voice of a woman who has paid a great price for a great truth, "The child I gave my body to abandoned me. But the woman who owed me nothing, carried me like I was everything. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything." I hope you enjoyed watching this story as much as I enjoyed creating it. Like, share, subscribe, and comment on the lessons you've learned. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. See you in the next one.